December 7th, 1941, 7:55 a.m. Waters near Ford Island, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, USA. Doris Miller, a 22-year-old black mess attendant, third class aboard the U.S. Navy battleship USS West Virginia, squatted in the laundry room on the lower deck of the officers' quarters. His hands were submerged in soapy water as he scrubbed vigorously at the officers' white uniforms, bubbles sliding off his fingertips to pull in a damp patch on the floor. Suddenly, a deafening explosion shattered Pearl Harbor's tranquility, sending the entire USS West Virginia lurching violently. The metal laundry tub flipped over, spilling soapy water and clothes across the floor. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered twice before going out completely, plunging the room into darkness. Moments later, the rattle of dense machine gun fire pierced the ship's steel hull, the rat-a-tat-tat of impacts exploding in their ears. The shipboard public address system blared with ear-splitting static, interspersed with fragmented shouts. "Enemy attack! Enemy attack! Japanese planes!" Doris Miller jumped to his feet, instinctively grabbing hold of the nearby metal laundry table to steady himself as his heart hammered wildly in his chest. As a black sailor confined to a support role by segregation policies, he had never received any formal military training. He had never even touched a weapon. In that moment, his mind was a whirlwind of chaos and panic. But the instinct for obedience forged by years of service aboard the ship kept him from fleeing. He groped along the wall for an emergency flashlight, flipped the switch, and a faint beam cut through the darkness. The steel plating of the corridor ahead was twisted and warped, thick smoke billowing through the cracks, carrying the acrid stench of gunpowder and fuel that made him cough violently. The corridor echoed with the clatter of running feet and screams of agony. Several sailors, their bodies ablaze, stumbled past, the sizzle of burning fabric mingling with their wails to paint a scene straight out of hell. "Up to the upper deck! Support the defense!" A bloodied officer shouted hoarsely as he ran past, only to be thrown violently against the wall by the shock wave of another explosion, falling motionless. Without hesitation, Doris Miller tightened his grip on the flashlight, hunched over, and groped his way forward through the smoke. The temperature in the corridor climbed steadily, waves of heat scorching his skin. Every breath felt like inhaling red-hot shards of glass. When he finally struggled to the entrance of the main deck, the sight before him made his pupils contract sharply. The deck of the USS West Virginia was riddled with bullet holes and engulfed in flames, the hull struck repeatedly by Japanese bombs. The anti-aircraft gun emplacements along the deck edges were either destroyed or deserted, their gunners dead or wounded, sprawled lifeless beside their weapons. Out on the water, the other battleships fared no better. The USS Arizona was completely shrouded in smoke, a massive fireball erupting from her midsection, followed by an even more devastating explosion, her hull beginning to sink rapidly. The USS Oklahoma, hit by multiple torpedoes, listed severely, scores of sailors leaping into the sea from her tilting deck, only to be trapped by the sheets of burning fuel floating on the water, their desperate cries ringing out. At that moment, Japanese carrier-based aircraft swarmed overhead like locusts, bombs and torpedoes cascading from their wings. The roar of explosions echoed endlessly, huge plumes of water erupting from the sea as Pearl Harbor seemed to be thrown into a furnace. The first wave of Japanese attackers numbered 183 aircraft, including 49 Type 99 carrier bombers, 51 Type 97 carrier attack planes, and 43 Zero fighter planes. Their focus was the concentrated U.S. battleship group in Pearl Harbor, their objective to annihilate the core of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. On the American side, caught completely off guard by the lack of effective warning, most ships were moored at anchor, their weapon systems not fully operational. Anti-aircraft ammunition was still locked away in magazines. The sailors, utterly unprepared, could only mount a hasty resistance, their defensive capabilities woefully inadequate. Doris Miller's gaze was suddenly drawn to the bridge amidships, which was also engulfed in flames. Several sailors clustered anxiously around a fallen figure. He recognized it as Captain Mervyn B. Bennion of the USS West Virginia. Struck by shrapnel from an explosion, Bennion had suffered severe wounds to his legs and abdomen, his consciousness fading. Blood soaked through his white uniform, staining the deck beneath him crimson. "Someone help the captain!" a young signalman cried, trying in vain to lift Bennion alone. Without a second thought, Doris Miller rushed forward, knelt down, and together with the signalman, struggled to lift the captain. "Toward the lifeboats at the stern! It's relatively safe there," Miller shouted to the signalman, and the two gritted their teeth, stumbling across the swaying deck, dodging falling burning debris and shell craters. As they moved, another wave of Japanese Zero fighters roared low overhead, machine gun fire spitting at the deck around them, the rat-a-tat-tat of bullets dangerously close. Doris Miller instinctively pulled Captain Bennion closer, shielding him with his own body as bullets whizzed past his shoulder, leaving a trail of fresh bullet holes in the steel plating behind him. He dared not pause, quickening his pace, and finally, 2 minutes later, carried Bennion to the relative safety of the lifeboat embarkation point at the stern, handing him over to the waiting corpsman. By now, his hands were burned by the searing heat of the deck, a gash on his arm oozing blood, but he had no time to tend to his wounds. His eyes darted back to the anti-aircraft gun emplacements on the main deck. He spotted a Browning M2.50 caliber anti-aircraft machine gun intact on the port side of the bow. The gunner lay dead beside it, his hands still clutching the weapon, blood staining the gun's metal body. At that moment, 3 Japanese Type 99 carrier bombers dove toward the USS West Virginia, the bombs beneath their wings clearly visible. A direct hit would send the already damaged battleship to the bottom of the harbor. The surrounding sailors were either fighting fires or rescuing the wounded, none sparing a glance for the abandoned gun emplacement. Doris Miller took a deep breath, his mind filled not with fear, but with a newfound resolve. He had never received any weapons training, had never even learned the basic mechanics of an anti-aircraft gun. But in that moment, this machine gun was the only hope of stopping the Japanese bombers. He sprinted to the emplacement, gently pushing the fallen gunner's body aside before gripping the cold metal handles of the machine gun. The weapon was far heavier than he had anticipated, its metal surface scorching hot from the sun and flames, burning his palms. He glanced down quickly at the gun's controls, relying on the vague memories of watching white gunners train during his time aboard the ship. He fumbled for the ammo box latch, wrenched it open, and fed a heavy belt of ammunition into the gun. Then, gripping the handles firmly, he adjusted the barrel's aim, locking onto the diving Japanese bombers. The enemy planes drew closer, the rising sun insignia on their wings clear as day. He could even make out the pilots' silhouettes. The scream of their dive grew louder, threatening to rupture his eardrums. "Now!" Doris Miller growled, squeezing the trigger with his index finger. The Browning M2 roared to life, a deep, resonant thump, 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 as brilliant muzzle flashes erupted from the barrel, a stream of .50 caliber bullets streaking toward the Japanese bombers. With no training in aiming, he relied purely on instinct to track the enemy planes' trajectories, adjusting the gun's direction accordingly. The lead Type 99 bomber seemed caught off guard by the sudden burst of fire, its fuselage jolting violently before it resumed its dive toward the ship. Doris Miller immediately adjusted his aim, focusing his fire on the bomber. Bullets tore into its wing, a loud crack of metal splitting echoing through the air as black smoke billowed from the damaged wing. But the bomber refused to go down. It released its payload before wobbling away from the battlefield, the bomb striking the water near the USS West Virginia's portside, sending a towering geyser of water skyward as the ship lurched violently once more. Just then, a Japanese Zero fighter spotted the active gun emplacement, banking sharply to dive toward Doris Miller. The rattle of its machine guns erupted, bullets peppering the deck around the emplacement, sending up a shower of sparks. Undaunted, Miller returned fire with the anti-aircraft gun, ducking behind the emplacement's armor plating to evade the incoming rounds. His eyes locked onto the Zero, the barrel of his gun tracking the fighter's every move as he maintained a steady stream of fire. The Zero was incredibly maneuverable, executing evasive rolls and turns with ease, but Miller's rate of fire was relentless. Finally, a burst of bullets found their mark, striking the fighter's engine compartment. Thick black smoke billowed from the engine, and the Zero lost control, spinning wildly in the air before slamming into the waters of Pearl Harbor with a thunderous explosion, sending a massive splash skyward. Several nearby American sailors cheered at the sight, but their celebration was quickly drowned out by another series of deafening explosions. Doris Miller did not let up, continuing to man the anti-aircraft gun, targeting other Japanese aircraft. His arms ached with fatigue, the gun's recoil jarring his shoulder with every shot, but he never faltered. By now, the USS West Virginia was listing heavily, water flooding multiple compartments, flames spreading across most of the main deck. Fuel flowed across the deck, forming pools of fire that distorted the air with their intense heat. Suddenly, the Browning M2 fell silent. Miller squeezed the trigger repeatedly, but nothing happened. Glancing down, he realized the ammo box was empty. The belt of ammunition had run dry. Without hesitation, he released the handles, jumped down from the emplacement, and charged once more into the smoke and flames. The ship's interior was a scene of utter devastation. The doors to many compartments had been sealed shut by explosions, the cries of trapped sailors echoing from within. Drawing on his intimate knowledge of the ship's layout, Miller groped his way to the block compartments, using his emergency wrench to pry open the twisted steel plating, desperate to create a path to safety. His movements were swift and decisive. His hands soon bloodied from the sharp edges of the metal, but he did not stop. Inside one compartment engulfed in flames, he found 3 trapped sailors, 2 unconscious from their wounds, the third crying out for help. Miller slung the 2 unconscious men over his shoulders one by one, carrying them to safety, before returning for the injured sailor, supporting him as they staggered out. As they fled, a section of the compartment's ceiling collapsed suddenly. Miller shoved the sailor out of the way, diving clear just in time as the steel plating crashed down where he had stood moments earlier, sparks flying in all directions. By this point, the USS West Virginia's list had exceeded 30 degrees, the ship on the verge of capsizing. Most of the crew had already evacuated, only a handful of sailors remaining on deck. Doris Miller continued to search for survivors, his uniform tattered and charred, his body covered in burns, but his eyes remained resolute. When he was certain there were no more trapped sailors left on the deck or within the ship's interior, he joined 2 other sailors in swimming toward the lifeboats bobbing on the water. The time was now 8:40 to 45 minutes had passed since the Japanese launched their first wave of attacks. Pearl Harbor was now shrouded in thicker smoke than ever before, the water littered with debris from sunken ships, pools of fuel, and the bodies of fallen sailors. The once peaceful harbor had been reduced to a wasteland of destruction. Doris Miller swam furiously toward the lifeboats, the frigid water stinging his wounds, but he paid it no mind. Glancing back at the slowly sinking USS West Virginia, he saw the American flag still flying proudly from her mast, tattered and blackened by smoke and flame. Little did he know that his actions on that fateful day would not only save the lives of numerous comrades, but also shatter the decades-old racial barriers within the U.S. Navy, marking a pivotal moment in American military history. This black mess attendant, untrained in the art of war, had in his nation's darkest hour embodied the true meaning of courage and duty, and his story was only just beginning to be told to the world. At that very moment, the second wave of Japanese attackers, 171 aircraft strong, arrived over Pearl Harbor, continuing their assault on the remaining U.S. ships and military installations. While American resistance was stronger than during the first wave, it remained woefully insufficient. The U.S. Pacific Fleet had suffered a crippling blow. Doris Miller, one of the last sailors to abandon the USS West Virginia, sat in the lifeboat, staring at the devastation before him, his heart heavy with a mix of emotions. He had no idea how long the war would last, nor what the future held for him. But he knew that what he had done that day was simply his duty as a sailor in the United States Navy. Amid the blood and flames of that tragic morning, Doris Miller cut a small and ordinary figure. But his courage shone like a beacon in Pearl Harbor's darkest hour. In the days and weeks to come, his story would transcend racial divides, spreading across the entire United States, forcing the nation to rethink the value of black servicemen and laying the very first seed for racial integration within the U.S. military. And in that moment, as he sat in the lifeboat amid the ruins of Pearl Harbor, he had no inkling that he was destined to become the first African American in U.S. Navy history to receive one of its highest honors, the Navy Cross. His name would be etched forever into the annals of American military history. To truly understand Doris Miller's extraordinary heroism during the attack on Pearl Harbor, one must first look back at the historical context and the racial barriers that defined the U.S. military at that time. By 1941, the Pacific Theater was already simmering with tension. Since launching its full-scale invasion of China in 1937, Japan's conflicts with Britain, the United States, and other Western powers had continued to escalate, particularly over the control of resources in Southeast Asia and the implementation of trade embargoes against Japan. Trapped in a strategic deadlock, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Japanese Navy Combined Fleet, devised a daring plan: a surprise carrier-based airstrike on Pearl Harbor, the heart of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, to destroy America's naval power in the Pacific in a single blow, clearing the way for Japan's southward expansion. Yamamoto's plan was an enormous gamble. The Japanese would need to assemble a massive task force, sail thousands of miles across the Pacific from Japan, and reach the waters near Pearl Harbor completely undetected. The task force centered on 6 aircraft carriers carrying 441 warplanes, supported by 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, and 3 submarines. Maintaining strict radio silence throughout the voyage, the fleet avoided all U.S. reconnaissance routes. To further deceive the Americans, Japan continued to send peace negotiation signals right up until the attack. Japanese ambassadors in Washington were even engaged in diplomatic talks with the U.S. government on the very day of the raid. This masterful act of strategic deception lulled the United States into a false sense of security. Meanwhile, although the United States had recognized that conflict with Japan was inevitable, military leaders widely believed that Japan's primary target would be British and Dutch colonial forces in Southeast Asia, not Pearl Harbor, thousands of miles away in Hawaii. This critical strategic miscalculation left Pearl Harbor's defenses fatally compromised. All 12 of the Pacific Fleet's battleships were moored tightly together in the harbor, their dense formation leaving no room for evasive action in the event of an air attack. Anti-aircraft gun crews lacked regular combat readiness training, with ammunition stored separately from the guns and requiring authorization from ordnance officers to access. While radar operators detected the incoming first wave of Japanese aircraft at 7:02, the on-duty officer misidentified them as a formation of U.S. bombers flying in from the mainland and issued no warning. These failures, compounded one upon another, turned Pearl Harbor into an undefended target. Against this backdrop, Doris Miller's personal story epitomized the racial segregation that plagued the U.S. Navy at the time. Born on October 12, 1919, in Waco, Texas, Doris Miller was the third of 6 children. His parents were sharecroppers, struggling to make ends meet. Miller completed elementary school before dropping out to work on the family farm and later in a local restaurant. In September 1939, at the age of 20, Miller enlisted in the U.S. Navy, hoping to escape the cycle of poverty. At the time, the U.S. Navy enforced a rigid policy of racial segregation, barring black sailors from serving in combat roles. Confined to the lowest-ranking support positions, cooks, laundrymen, laborers, black sailors could advance no higher than the rank of petty officer 3rd class, and were generally prohibited from serving on major combat vessels such as destroyers, except in menial roles like cooks or stewards. Upon enlisting, Miller was assigned to the USS West Virginia as a mess attendant 3rd class, his primary duties including preparing meals for officers, laundering their uniforms, and cleaning their quarters. His monthly salary was a mere $21, far less than that of his white counterparts. Aboard the ship, black sailors were segregated into separate living quarters, forbidden from using the same mess halls, bathrooms, or recreational facilities as white sailors, and were not even allowed to speak to them without permission. Most significantly, the Navy explicitly prohibited black sailors from receiving any weapons training, with military officials claiming that blacks lacked the intelligence and courage to serve as combat soldiers. During his 2 years of service aboard the USS West Virginia, Miller never touched a single firearm. His only knowledge of weapons like anti-aircraft guns and torpedoes came from observing white sailors during their training exercises. This deeply entrenched racial discrimination was not unique to the U.S. Navy, but permeated every aspect of American society. In 1941, Southern states still enforced the Jim Crow laws, imposing systematic racial segregation in education, employment, and public facilities. The injustice faced by black servicemen in the military was merely a reflection of this broader societal reality. In the Pacific Fleet, black sailors accounted for less than 2% of the total personnel and were concentrated entirely in support roles, viewed as disposable labor rather than as true soldiers. No one could have predicted that in the chaos of the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, it would be this marginalized black cook who would perform feats of bravery that would astonish the entire U.S. military. The Japanese, meanwhile, spared no effort in preparing for the attack. For months, pilots of the strike force underwent intensive specialized training in Kagoshima Bay, Japan, practicing dive bombing and torpedo attacks against targets specifically designed to simulate the layout of Pearl Harbor and the mooring positions of U.S. warships. The Japanese also modified their torpedoes, shortening their fins to allow them to operate effectively in Pearl Harbor's shallow waters, where the average depth was a mere 12 meters, rendering standard torpedoes useless as they would simply sink to the bottom. In addition, Japan deployed several midget submarines to infiltrate Pearl Harbor prior to the airstrike, coordinating with the carrier-based aircraft to attack U.S. ships and block their escape routes. On November 26, 1941, the Japanese task force departed from Hitakapu Bay on Torafu Island in the Kuril Islands, setting course for Pearl Harbor under strict secrecy. On December 6th, the fleet reached its designated launch position approximately 420 kilometers north of Pearl Harbor. At 0600 on the morning of December 7th, the first wave of Japanese aircraft took off from the 6 aircraft carriers, forming up into a strike formation and heading toward Pearl Harbor. At that moment, Pearl Harbor still slumbered in the quiet of a Sunday morning. Most sailors were asleep in their bunks, while officers prepared for breakfast or engaged in leisure activities. No one realized that death was hurtling toward them from the sky. U.S. defenses were further undermined by critical failures in intelligence gathering and sharing. As early as the second half of 1941, U.S. Army intelligence had intercepted a large number of encrypted Japanese diplomatic cables, successfully decoding portions of them to learn that Japan was engaged in large-scale military mobilization and was showing intense interest in Southeast Asia and the Pacific region. However, due to a lack of effective information sharing between different intelligence agencies, these fragmented pieces of intelligence never coalesced into a coherent warning. Even worse, naval intelligence failed to promptly notify Pearl Harbor's garrison of intercepted intelligence regarding the movement of Japanese naval forces, leaving the defenders completely unprepared when the first wave of enemy aircraft arrived. The USS West Virginia, aboard which Doris Miller served, was the second ship of the U.S. Navy's Colorado-class battleships. Commissioned in 1923, she had a standard displacement of 32,600 tons and a full load displacement of 37,000 tons. Armed with 8 16-inch, 406 mm main guns, 12 5-inch, 127 mm secondary guns, and 40 20 mm anti-aircraft guns, she had a crew complement of 1,500 men. Prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor, the USS West Virginia had just completed a major overhaul, making her one of the most combat-ready battleships in the Pacific Fleet. However, due to the U.S. military's complacency and poor preparedness, this powerful warship was caught completely off guard by the Japanese attack, becoming one of their primary targets. On the morning of December the 7th, Miller had risen early as usual, first cleaning the officers' quarters before preparing breakfast. After the meal, he reported to the laundry room as scheduled to wash the uniforms the officers had worn the previous day, a routine part of his daily duties. He could never have imagined that his life would be transformed irrevocably in the minutes to come, nor that he would shatter decades of racial prejudice within the U.S. Navy in such a spectacular and heroic manner. At the time, the U.S. Navy not only barred black sailors from combat roles, but also prohibited them from receiving combat decorations, except for medals recognizing service in support roles. The promotion path for black sailors was completely blocked. No matter how exemplary their performance, they could never hope to receive the same treatment as white sailors. This institutionalized discrimination wasted the talents of countless capable black servicemen depriving the U.S. military of a valuable source of combat strength. Doris Miller's actions during the attack on Pearl Harbor would shatter the myth that blacks were unfit for combat, laying the groundwork for future efforts to secure equal rights for black servicemen. The Japanese attack was not only a devastating military blow to the U.S. Pacific Fleet, but also a direct assault on the security of the U.S. homeland. Japan had not declared war on the United States before launching the attack, and this act of treachery sparked widespread outrage among the American public. On December 8th, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress, declaring December 7th, a date which will live in infamy, and formally declared war on Japan, marking the full entry of the United States into the Pacific War. In the immediate chaos following the outbreak of war, however, Doris Miller's heroic deeds did not receive widespread attention. It was only weeks later, when survivors of the USS West Virginia were interviewed by journalists, that the story of this black cook's bravery finally came to light, capturing the attention of the entire nation. With this historical context in mind, every action Miller took on that fateful day takes on greater significance. His decisiveness in evacuating Captain Bennion, his resolve in manning the anti-aircraft gun, his fearlessness in rescuing the wounded, none of these were acts of chance. They stem from a deep sense of duty and a profound commitment to the lives of his fellow sailors. Though marginalized by the Navy's segregationist policies, when his country faced mortal danger, he did not hesitate to stand his ground, embodying the true meaning of the word soldier. Now let us return to Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, to recount in detail the full story of Doris Miller's courageous fight with the anti-aircraft gun and his heroic rescue of wounded sailors. We will also analyze the performance of the Browning M2 anti-aircraft machine gun he used and the technical characteristics of the Japanese Zero fighter, exploring the tactical details and weaponry that define this intense battle. At 7:58 on December 7, 1941, the echoes of the explosion in the USS West Virginia's laundry room still reverberated as Doris Miller clung to the swaying corridor walls, making his way toward the upper deck. Inside the ship, thick smoke spread rapidly through the ventilation ducts, the dim green glow of emergency lights flickering in the darkness, casting eerie shadows through the haze. The ship's list grew more pronounced by the second, every step a struggle as his boots slipped on the wet steel plating, a slippery mix of soapy water and seawater beneath his feet. When Miller reached the main deck at 7:59, the first wave of Japanese attacks was in full swing. The Browning M2.50 caliber anti-aircraft machine gun before him was one of the standard air defense weapons aboard U.S. Navy ships at the time, and the key to Miller's heroic stand. Designed by the renowned American firearms engineer John Moses Browning, the M2 was officially adopted in 1921, with an overall length of 1,650 millimeters, a barrel length of 1,143 millimeters, and a total weight of 58.2 kilograms. It fired .50 BMG, 12.7 by 99 millimeters. Large caliber ammunition at a theoretical rate of fire of 450 to 600 rounds per minute. It had an effective range of 1,830 meters and a maximum range of 6,800 meters. Utilizing a short recoil operation system in a rising block locking mechanism, the M2 was renowned for its exceptional durability and reliability, capable of operating flawlessly in harsh environments of extreme heat, humidity, and vibration. It was one of the U.S. military's most trusted air defense and anti-armor weapons during World War II. To Miller, however, the gun was a strange and intimidating metal beast. He had never received any firearms training, not even knowing how to adjust the sights. The fallen gunner beside the emplacement still had his fingers curled around the trigger guard, the ammo box open beside him, a full 250-round belt of ammunition spilled on the deck. Miller had no time to hesitate. He first gently moved the gunner's body to the side of the emplacement, his movements a mix of reverence and urgency. Then he climbed into the gunner's seat, gripping the cold metal handles. This was the first time he had ever touched a weapon. The Browning M2's handles were spaced wide apart, designed to be held comfortably by an adult male's hands, with non-slip ridges on the grip to ensure a firm hold. Drawing on the vague memories of watching white sailors train, Miller planted his feet shoulder-width apart to steady his stance. bracing himself against the gun's powerful recoil. He then glanced down to locate the ammunition feed tray, carefully repositioning the spilled belt and feeding it into the tray until he heard a satisfying click, confirming that the belt was securely seated. It took him 2 attempts to get it right. His hands had trembled with nervousness the first time, causing the belt to slip out of alignment. At that moment, 8:01, 3 Japanese Type 99 carrier bombers, codenamed Val, approached in a wedge formation, diving toward the USS West Virginia's bridge at a 45-degree angle. The Type 99 was the Imperial Japanese Navy's primary carrier-based dive bomber in the early years of World War II. With a length of 10.2 meters, a wingspan of 14.3 meters, an empty weight of 2.8 tons, and a maximum takeoff weight of 4.3 tons. It was powered by a single Mitsubishi Kinsei 44 radial engine, capable of a top speed of 432 kilometers per hour and a range of 1,430 kilometers. Armed with one forward-firing 7.7 millimeter machine gun and one rearward-firing 7.7 millimeter machine gun, it could carry either one 800-kilogram armor-piercing bomb or two 250-kilogram high-explosive bombs, making it the primary weapon used by the Japanese to attack U.S. battleships. "Dive bombers incoming! Enemy dive bombers!" a lookout shouted frantically. With no time to adjust the gun's sights, Miller aimed directly through the M2's front sight guard, locking onto the lead Type 99 bomber. He could clearly see the 800-kilogram armor-piercing bomb hanging beneath the plane's wing, its fins glinting in the sunlight. Taking a deep breath, Miller squeezed the trigger with his right index finger. Thump, thump, thump! The Browning M2 roared to life, brilliant muzzle flashes erupting from the barrel as spent shell casings ejected from the weapon, clattering onto the hot steel deck. The gun's recoil was far more powerful than Miller had expected, jolting his shoulder violently with every shot, his arms growing numb from the vibration. But he held fast, his grip never wavering. He employed a technique known as tracer-guided fire. U.S. .50 caliber ammunition was loaded with one tracer round for every 5 standard rounds, the tracers emitting a bright red light that allowed the gunner to visually track the trajectory of their fire. Miller fixed his eyes on the red streaks of light, adjusting the gun's aim continuously to guide the bullets toward the Japanese bomber's flight path. The pilot of the lead Type 99 bomber was clearly caught off guard by the sudden burst of fire from the supposedly abandoned emplacement, yanking the control stick to bank the plane sharply to the left in an evasive maneuver. But Miller's rate of fire was relentless, nearly 500 rounds per minute, forming a dense wall of lead. The red tracer rounds streaked through the air like bolts of lightning, zeroing in on the bomber's wing. At 8:02, a loud crack of splitting metal echoed across the water as the lead Type 99's right wing was torn open by the gunfire, its fabric skin shredded to reveal the metal framework beneath, thick black smoke billowing from the damaged wing. The bomber did not crash immediately, however. Demonstrating exceptional skill, the pilot managed to regain control of the damaged aircraft long enough to release its 800-kilogram armor-piercing bomb. The bomb plummeted toward the water, striking the USS West Virginia's port side approximately 3 meters below the waterline. There was a thunderous explosion, and a gaping hole, 5 meters in diameter, was torn into the ship's hull plating. Seawater poured into the ship's compartments in a torrent, causing the vessel to list 5 degrees to port instantly. Miller was thrown off balance by the force of the explosion, nearly falling from the gun emplacement, but he clung tightly to the handles, steadying himself before resuming fire on the second Type 99 bomber. Seeing its companion damaged, the second bomber abandoned its dive, climbing rapidly in an attempt to escape. Miller immediately swung the gun's barrel around, tracking the retreating plane's trajectory. The tracer rounds arced gracefully through the air, striking the bomber's tail assembly dead center. With its tail damaged, the plane lost stability, spinning wildly in the air twice before crashing into the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor, approximately 300 meters from the USS West Virginia, sending a massive plume of water skyward. By 8:03, Miller had been firing continuously for 2 minutes, expending nearly 1,000 rounds of ammunition. His arms ached with exhaustion, sweat streaming down his face. mixing with oil and seawater to leave streaks of grime across his skin. Just then, a Japanese Zero fighter, codenamed Zeke, spotted Miller's gun emplacement. The Zero was the Imperial Japanese Navy's primary carrier-based fighter in the early years of World War II and one of the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world at the time. With a length of 9.06 meters, a wingspan of 12 meters, an empty weight of 1,680 kilograms, and a maximum takeoff weight of 2,670 kilograms, it was powered by two Mitsubishi Sakai 12 radial engines, capable of a top speed of 533 kilometers per hour and an impressive range of 2,200 kilometers. Armed with two 7.7 millimeter machine guns and two 20 millimeter cannons, the Zero was renowned for its exceptional maneuverability, tight turning radius, and rapid climb rate, dominating the skies in the early years of the Pacific War and earning the nickname Ghost of the Pacific among American pilots. The Zero streaked low over Miller's left side, the 20 millimeter cannons beneath its wings erupting in a hail of fire. Bullets rained down on the deck around the emplacement, sending up a shower of sparks. Miller could clearly see the pilot's white flight cap as he stared down at the gun position, targeting it with deadly accuracy. Undeterred, Miller swung the Browning M2 around, returning fire at the Zero as it closed in. The Zero was incredibly agile, executing a series of sharp S-turns to evade the incoming fire, the red tracer rounds streaking past the plane's fuselage time, and again without finding their mark. Miller quickly adjusted his tactics. Instead of tracking the fighter's current position, he began leading his target, aiming the gun at the point where he anticipated the Zero would be, rather than where it was, a technique commonly used by experienced anti-aircraft gunners, and one that Miller instinctively grasped in the heat of battle. At 8:04, as the Zero dove once more to strafe the emplacement, Miller squeezed the trigger 2 seconds early. A burst of .50 caliber bullets struck the fighter's engine compartment dead center. Thick black smoke billowed from the engine immediately, the Zero's propeller slowing rapidly as it lost power. The pilot attempted to bail out, but he was flying too low. His parachute failed to fully deploy. The Zero, trailing thick smoke, plummeted toward the waters of Pearl Harbor at a near vertical angle, slamming into the sea with a thunderous explosion that sent a mushroom cloud of water and smoke skyward. The nearby American sailors cheered loudly at the sight, but their celebration was quickly drowned out by another series of deafening explosions. By now, the USS West Virginia's list had increased to 15 degrees, and flames from the burning deck had spread to within meters of the gun emplacement, the intense heat scorching Miller's back. Miller did not cease fire, continuing to man the anti-aircraft gun and targeting the third Type 99 bomber. Seeing two of its companions either damaged or destroyed, the third bomber abandoned its attack run entirely, climbing steeply and fleeing the battlefield. At 8:05, the Browning M2 fell silent abruptly. Miller squeezed the trigger repeatedly, but only heard the click-click of an empty chamber. Glancing down, he saw that the ammo box was empty. The 250-round belt had been completely exhausted. Without hesitation, he released the gun's handles, jumping down from the emplacement. His shoulder was now bright red and swollen from the recoil, his hands stiff and numb from gripping the gun's handle so tightly. But he did not evacuate. Instead, he turned and charged once more into the smoke-shrouded interior of the ship. Conditions inside the vessel were even more desperate than on the deck, with water flooding multiple compartments and flames spreading rapidly along the electrical cables, triggering a series of secondary explosions. Drawing on his intimate knowledge of the USS West Virginia's layout, Miller groped his way forward through the darkness, his mission now to rescue as many trapped sailors as possible, a duty born not only of his role as a mess attendant, but of his own innate sense of compassion. At 8:07, in a crew compartment amidships, Miller found 3 trapped sailors. The compartment's entrance had been sealed shut by a collapsed section of steel plating from an explosion, faint cries for help echoing from within. Miller pulled the emergency wrench from his belt, the only tool he had, and began prying at the twisted metal. The steel plates screeched in protest as they scraped against each other, sparks flying in all directions. His hands were soon raw and bleeding, the wounds stinging fiercely as sweat and seawater seeped into them, but he refused to stop. After 3 minutes of relentless effort, Miller finally managed to pry open a small gap in the steel plating, barely large enough for a man to crawl through. He first squeezed his way inside, assessing the situation. Of the 3 sailors, 2 had suffered leg injuries and were unable to stand, while the third had a head wound and was barely conscious. Miller slung the unconscious sailor over his shoulder, carefully crawling back through the gap and carrying him to the relative safety of the deck, where he handed him over to a waiting corpsman. He then returned to the compartment, helping the 2 injured sailors to their feet and guiding them through the gap one by one. At 8:12, just as Miller was helping the last injured sailor to safety, the crew compartment erupted in a secondary explosion. The entire ceiling collapsed, sealing the gap completely. Had Miller been just 1 minute slower, he would have been trapped inside forever. He had no time to catch his breath, immediately heading toward the ship's engine room at the stern, the heart of the vessel and the most likely place to find trapped sailors. The temperature inside the engine room exceeded 50 degrees Celsius, the air thin and choked with the acrid stench of coal smoke and fuel. Miller's breathing became rapid and shallow, his vision growing blurry from the heat and fumes. He searched the engine room for nearly 5 minutes, but found no survivors, only the bodies of several fallen sailors. He paused for a moment, saluting them with a clumsy but heartfelt gesture of respect, before turning to make his escape. By 8:20, the USS West Virginia's list had reached 25 degrees, water flooding the ship's compartments at an ever-increasing rate. Flames had spread to the lifeboat embarkation point at the stern, and most of the crew had already evacuated, leaving only Miller and 2 other sailors on the deck. The 2 men were signalman Thomas Reed and gunner's mate Robert Jones, who were struggling to lower the last remaining lifeboat into the water. Miller rushed forward to help, the 3 men working together to push the heavy lifeboat toward the deck's edge. The boat weighed approximately 500 kilograms, and moving it on the steeply listing deck was an arduous task. Their boots slipped repeatedly, and their uniforms were soaked through with sweat. At 8:25, the lifeboat was finally lowered successfully into the water, already carrying more than a dozen injured sailors. Reed and Jones climbed aboard, shouting back to Miller, "Miller, jump! The ship's going down!" Miller did not jump immediately. Instead, he turned and ran back toward the bridge, desperate to confirm that Captain Bennion had been evacuated safely. When he reached the bridge area, he spotted the corpsman loading the captain onto another lifeboat, which was already heading toward Ford Island in the distance. Assured of the captain's safety, Miller finally turned and ran back toward the stern lifeboat. At 8:30, Miller leaped into the frigid waters of Pearl Harbor. The water temperature was approximately 20 degrees Celsius, the cold seeping into his wounds and sending waves of pain through his body. He swam furiously toward the lifeboat, but when he was still about 50 meters away, the USS West Virginia was rocked by a massive explosion. A gaping hole was torn into the ship's midsection, thick smoke and flames shooting skyward as the vessel's list suddenly increased to more than 30 degrees, and she began to sink rapidly. The force of the explosion sent a huge wave crashing over Miller, pushing him nearly 10 meters away from the lifeboat. He choked on a mouthful of seawater, coughing violently, but he refused to give up, continuing to swim towards safety. At 8:35, the sailors aboard the lifeboat finally pulled Miller from the water. He collapsed onto the deck of the lifeboat, gasping for breath, staring at the rapidly sinking USS West Virginia with a mix of sorrow and relief. At that moment, the second wave of Japanese aircraft, 171 planes strong, including 54 Type 99 carrier bombers, 78 Type 97 carrier attack planes, and 39 Zero fighters, arrived over Pearl Harbor. The primary targets of the second wave were the remaining U.S. ships, airfields, and military installations. American defenses had improved somewhat, with anti-aircraft guns now firing in coordinated volleys, and a handful of fighter planes scrambling to intercept the attackers. However, due to the heavy losses sustained during the first wave, U.S. defensive capabilities remained severely limited. Miller's lifeboat headed toward the docks on Ford Island, passing through waters littered with the wreckage of sunken ships, pools of burning fuel, and the bodies of fallen sailors. The once crystal-clear blue water had turned a murky black. In the distance, the USS Arizona had already slipped beneath the waves, only her mast protruding above the surface, bubbles still rising from the water as air escaped from her submerged hull. The USS Oklahoma had capsized completely, her hull resting upside down on the harbor floor, her massive propellers exposed to the sky. At 8:45, the lifeboat reached the docks on Ford Island. Miller and the other survivors were transferred to a temporary medical station on the island. Corman treated his injuries, swollen shoulder, scraped hands, and burned back. But Miller was exhausted beyond measure. Leaning against the wall of the medical station, he fell asleep almost immediately. He had no idea that his heroic actions had been witnessed by several surviving officers, who would ensure that his story was told to the world. During the entire attack on Pearl Harbor, the USS West Virginia was struck by 6 torpedoes and 2 bombs, sustaining catastrophic damage before finally sinking. The attack claimed the lives of 106 crew members and injured 52 others. The first wave of Japanese aircraft withdrew at 8:40, and the second wave departed at 9:45, bringing the nearly 110-minute attack to an end. The U.S. Pacific Fleet suffered devastating losses. 8 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 3 destroyers were either sunk or severely damaged. 188 aircraft were destroyed on the ground, and total casualties numbered 3,435, 2,403 dead, and 1,032 wounded. The Japanese, by contrast, lost only 29 aircraft and 5 submarines, with fewer than 100 casualties, achieving a lopsided and decisive victory. Doris Miller, the untrained black cook, had in the midst of this catastrophe saved the life of his captain, shot down 1 Japanese Zero fighter, damaged 1 Type 99 bomber, and rescued 3 trapped sailors, emerging as one of the last 3 men to abandon the sinking USS West Virginia. His actions not only saved the lives of his comrades, but also cracked the foundations of the segregationist system that had long oppressed black sailors in the U.S. Navy, planting the seeds of change for racial equality in the military. On the afternoon of December 7, 1941, Doris Miller woke from his exhausted sleep to find the temporary medical station filled with the moans of the wounded and the sharp smell of antiseptic. He did not boast of his heroic deeds, simply joining the effort to transport injured sailors to more permanent medical facilities. At that time, Pearl Harbor was just beginning the arduous process of rescue and recovery. U.S. military leaders were preoccupied with tallying losses and stabilizing morale, paying little attention to the ordinary black cook who had fought so bravely. Miller's story spread initially only through word of mouth among the survivors of the USS West Virginia until January 1942, when a reporter from the Dallas Morning News interviewed the ship's survivors and learned of his heroism from Lieutenant Commander Charles Cook, the USS West Virginia's executive officer. On January 12, 1942, the Dallas Morning News published the first public account of Miller's deeds, under the headline, "Unnamed Black Cook Fights Valiantly at Pearl Harbor." The article detailed his rescue of Captain Bennion, his brave stand with the anti-aircraft gun, and his tireless efforts to save wounded sailors, hailing him as a hero of Pearl Harbor. The story was quickly picked up by newspapers across the United States, including the New York Times and the Washington Post, catapulting Miller's name to national fame virtually overnight. The American public was captivated by the story of the black cook who had risen to the occasion in his nation's hour of need. And a flood of letters poured into the U.S. Navy Department, demanding that Miller be formally recognized for his courage. However, in the segregated America of the 1940s, the process of honoring Miller was fraught with obstacles. Many senior U.S. Navy officials argued that black sailors were unworthy of receiving combat decorations and advocated awarding Miller only a medal for his service in a support role. This decision sparked widespread public outrage. Civil rights organizations seized on the opportunity to launch a campaign demanding equal honor for Miller, pressuring the Navy to abandon its racist policies and acknowledge Miller's extraordinary heroism. Faced with mounting public pressure and recognizing the need to boost military morale, Admiral Ernest King, the Chief of Naval Operations, finally decided to award Miller the Navy Cross, the U.S. Navy's second highest combat decoration, surpassed only by the Medal of Honor. On May 27, 1942, the award ceremony was held at the Washington Navy Yard. Representing President Franklin D. Roosevelt, Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox personally presented Miller with the Navy Cross. In his citation, Knox declared, "Mess Attendant Third Class Doris Miller's extraordinary courage and disregard for his own safety were beyond the call of duty, serving as an inspiration to all members of the United States Armed Forces. His actions in the face of grave danger demonstrated that courage knows no color and duty transcends rank." Dressed in a crisp U.S. Navy uniform, Miller stood tall on the ceremony stage, becoming the first African American in U.S. Navy history to receive the Navy Cross. In that moment, Miller was not only being honored for his individual bravery, but also striking a powerful blow against the U.S. Navy's long-standing policy of racial segregation. Despite receiving this prestigious award, Miller was not reassigned to a combat role. Instead, the Navy sent him on a national speaking tour. Traveling to more than 20 states across the country, Miller shared his experiences of the attack on Pearl Harbor, urging Americans to support the war effort in speaking out against racial discrimination. His speeches resonated deeply with audiences across the nation, drawing widespread attention to the plight of black servicemen in the U.S. military. Civil rights organizations seized on Miller's fame, using his story as a powerful tool to advocate for the desegregation of the armed forces and applying increasing pressure on the U.S. government to open combat roles to black sailors. Driven by Miller's heroic example and the pressing manpower needs of the war, the U.S. Navy's segregationist policies began to loosen. In June 1942, the Navy Department announced that black sailors would be allowed to receive formal military training and serve in certain non-frontline combat roles, such as anti-aircraft gunners and radio operators. In 1943, the Navy took another step forward, permitting black sailors to enlist in the Marine Corps and Coast Guard's combat units. While these policies still contained numerous restrictions and fell short of full racial equality, they represented a critical turning point in the long struggle for integration within the U.S. military. By the end of World War II in 1945, the percentage of black sailors in the U.S. Navy had increased from less than 2% in 1941 to 10%, with more than 30% of black sailors serving in combat roles, a direct legacy of Doris Miller's courage. Notably, Miller himself remained humble throughout his newfound fame. During his speaking tour, he never referred to himself as a hero, repeatedly emphasizing, "I only did what any other American sailor would have done in my place. I hope that my story will help people realize that black sailors are just as willing to sacrifice everything for our country, and that all we ask for is a fair chance." In 1943, after completing his speaking tour, Miller volunteered to return to active duty. The Navy Department finally approved his request, assigning him to the USS Liscum Bay, a Casablanca-class escort carrier, as a mess attendant, third class, and qualified anti-aircraft gunner, marking the first time he would serve in an official combat role. During his service aboard the USS Liscum Bay, Miller received comprehensive military training, mastering the operation of anti-aircraft guns, radio equipment, and other weapon systems. His exceptional performance earned him the respect of both his fellow sailors and his superiors, who no longer viewed him through the lens of racial prejudice. In November 1943, the USS Liscum Bay was deployed to the Pacific Theater to participate in the Battle of Tarawa, the first major amphibious assault launched by U.S. forces in the Pacific War. The objective of the battle was to capture the Japanese-held Tarawa Atoll, establishing a forward base for future U.S. offensives in the region. On November 24, 1943, while the USS Liscum Bay was performing escort duties near Tarawa Atoll, she was struck by a torpedo fired by a Japanese submarine. The torpedo hit the carrier's ammunition magazine, triggering a catastrophic explosion. The force of the blast destroyed most of the ship's hull, and flames spread rapidly across the deck as the vessel began to sink. Miller was on deck performing sentry duty at the time of the attack. When the explosion occurred, he did not flee. Instead, he once again displayed the same courage he had shown at Pearl Harbor, assisting his comrades in rescuing trapped sailors. According to the accounts of surviving crew members, Miller carried 5 injured sailors to safety on lifeboats following the explosion. He then remained on the sinking carrier's deck, manning an anti-aircraft gun to provide cover against potential Japanese air attacks. Only when the USS Liscombe Bay's list exceeded 45 degrees and it became clear that the ship could not be saved did Miller attempt to evacuate. But at that moment, the carrier was rocked by a second, even more powerful explosion, splitting her hull in two. Miller was thrown into the sea by the force of the blast and never resurfaced. At the age of just 24, Doris Miller gave his life for his country, his body lost forever in the waters of the Pacific Ocean. News of Miller's death sent shockwaves across the United States, sparking nationwide mourning. Civil rights organizations held memorial services in his honor, and thousands of Americans traveled to his hometown of Waco, Texas, to pay their respects to the hero who had shattered racial barriers. To honor Miller's legacy, the U.S. Navy named a Gearing-class destroyer, the USS Miller DD-535, the first U.S. Navy warship to be named after an African American. Commissioned in 1944, the USS Miller served with distinction in the Pacific Theater, participating in numerous combat operations and contributing to the ultimate Allied victory over Japan. Miller's sacrifice underscored the urgent need for racial integration in the U.S. military. In the aftermath of World War II, the American civil rights movement gained significant momentum, with the segregation of the armed forces emerging as a major point of public contention. On July 26, 1948, President Harry S. Truman signed Executive Order 9981, officially abolishing racial segregation in the U.S. Armed Forces. The order declared that all persons in the armed services shall receive equal treatment and opportunity without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin. The signing of Executive Order 9981 marked the beginning of full racial integration in the U.S. military. And Doris Miller's heroic legacy was one of the most powerful catalysts for this historic change. In the decades following his death, Miller's story has continued to be remembered and celebrated. In 1973, the U.S. Postal Service issued a commemorative stamp honoring Miller. In 1991, a statue of Miller was unveiled at the Pearl Harbor Memorial, immortalizing his courage during the attack on Pearl Harbor. In 2001, the U.S. Navy announced that a Gerald R. Ford-class nuclear-powered aircraft carrier would be named the USS Doris Miller CVN-81, the first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier in U.S. Navy history to be named after an African American. This honor stands as a testament to Miller's enduring legacy and his indelible place in American military history. If you like this story about courage and breaking prejudice, please subscribe to my channel, like this video, and turn on the notification bell. We will continue to bring you more touching military history stories. See you in the next video.